Healing mechanics. It's tough being Grass Healing's strongest soldier, but someone has to do this. Over the years, it has become near gospel in the From Software gaming circle that the transition from Demon Souls' Grass Healing system over to Dark Souls' Estes was an obviously positive change which needed to happen. Grass Healing was broken, they say, and some go so far as to assert that Estes Healing is better in every way. The more game direction savvy will usually at least note that there was some merit to the Grass system lost in the transition, but most of them will still conclude that because Estes Healing does not have any grinding, it is better, or something like that. The conclusion that Estes is better is an analysis which has never really sat right with me. I've never tried to make my fondness for heavy-duty survival horror games secret, and I genuinely love seeing a game director being given access to resource management to set the mood of a given moment. But even so, I don't think my preference for Grass Healing comes about exclusively because of nostalgia. These different healing systems both have strengths and weaknesses, and each is capable of doing things which the other simply isn't able to. And the reason I'm making this video isn't so much to pit the two against each other, to find out which is objectively the superior one, because I've actually run the poll and know that I'd be crucified for pitching Grass is better, but it's more so because the Estes conversation seems to always take for granted that Grass Healing was obviously broken and in need of repair, and it always seems to neglect the wider consequences this change brought about. I don't think the implementation in Demon Souls was perfect or anything, but I can't really see how Estes was an improvement in every way, like I keep seeing people say whenever this is brought up. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll have a deeper appreciation of what these distinct variations of healing systems have to offer their respective experiences. And hopefully, if you don't already, you'll appreciate just how much the distinct identity of each of these games I'm covering here can be traced back to how they distribute healing to the player, and how the player is made to manage their healing resources. Quick note, before going any further, for the duration of this video, I'm purely talking about the single-player experiences for these games. I'm AesirAesthetics, consider subscribing, cool people subscribe, help me reach 50k. Consider liking the video, and if you want, comment which system you prefer going in, and if any points here made you reevaluate things. With all of this out of the way, let's get into it. Hope you have some coffee on side. Grass Healing is a throwback to the old Kingsfield games, where healing was also done with grass found in levels and bought from vendors. Those games had the hands-off approach to storytelling which later FromSoft games have as well, but on steroids, and to get the narrative across, the standard tactic employed across the Kingsfields, and the Shadow Towers for that matter, was to either have characters warp around the map to fill the player in on the preceding happenings, or to have a central hub for the player to decompress and socialize, and the way those hubs were integrated into the player's experience was mainly by the placement of those healing item vendors. Players kept needing the stuff NPC vendors sold, so they kept going back to meet them, and that's where the developers were able to sneak some of the narrative into the player's experience without railroading them into knowing it. That's something you find in Demon Souls as well, even though I'm not 100% sold on the Nexus as a hub. I think making the central hub be so very disconnected from the rest of the game helps sell the dreamlike nature of the world, and it also works to make the land feel big since you need to actually warp around it instead of being able to just walk everywhere like in Dark Souls. But the Nexus is much more forced into the experience than something like Firelink Shrine. Firelink Shrine is also absolutely railroaded into the player's experience in Dark Souls 1, but it doesn't feel as forced because the player goes back there because the area links off to so many other locations rather than that area being a middle point in between two loading screens like the Nexus is in Demon Souls. Level design organically takes you back to Firelink Shrine, necessity forces you back to the Nexus, and you can really feel that in the moment. The governing mood of the different games is going to be a big topic in this video, so it's worth talking about how the implementations of the different systems help prop those moods up and what the developers needed to do in order for these systems to work. For example, the Nexus has some mechanics masquerading as characters, like Stockpile Thomas, who is our war chest. He stores the stuff we pick up in the levels, and that's actually a necessity in Demon Souls, because Demon Souls has a love it or hate it mechanic in item burden. Demon's Souls is a very transitionary piece owing to its rocky production. We know that FromSoft was hired by Sony to make a fantasy game playable in both first and third person. Miyazaki has actually mused that he thinks Sony was looking for a title to compete with Oblivion, and that as development went on, things went off the rails. Miyazaki's contribution to the From Software identity was seemingly to eco-fy their games, that is, tighter direction and third-person cameras. Once those ideas were injected into the old FromSoft dungeon crawlers, Demon's Souls springs out pretty fully formed, conceptually at least. There's a lot of growing pains, and item burden was one of those. It's part of a trend which I love in these games, which is how in-game mechanics are contextualized with characters. See what we talked about with Stockpile Thomas, how de-aggroing NPCs in Dark Souls is done by talking to a pardoner NPC, or how we always level up by talking to the level ladies. Demon's Souls restricts how much stuff the player can carry on their person at any given time, and everything physically carried feeds into this. So if the player is struggling and decides to offset the damage they're taking by wearing very heavy armor, they actually limit the amount of healing items they can carry at any given time. In theory, the item burden mechanic empowers the game director a lot because they have more strings to pull at the player with. When the player walks past a white flame in Demon's Souls, the developers can rely on every instance of them to titillate the player because the ratio of valuable items to trash is so much better balanced than it was after they decoupled healing and looting in some subsequent games. And because the healing is incorporated into the loot mechanic which you get your weapons and armors from, the risk versus reward of taking a few more steps to get the loot can elicit a kind of hope not present in subsequent games, because if the player is struggling, there's always that little tiny chance that they're just about to pick up some health. That is, if the player just pushes a bit further, they'll catch a break.
Dark Souls' bonfires kinda sorta prop that desperate and hoping for relief experience up in that game, but because healing there is always free, and it is, don't comment yet, we'll get to this, and because there's no investment on the player's side in any run other than their time, I can't say that game capitalizes on the relief experience quite as much as Demon's Souls did. Because healing in Demon's Souls is incorporated into the lootable items, it can play on your hope for loot in more dire ways than subsequent games can. Also, with the item burden, because the grass takes up limited carrying weight, players have decision-making to do which cannot really be reversed without going back to the Nexus and offloading some items on Stockpile Thomas. In theory, this dedicates the runs through levels much more. Cleverly implemented resource management can move the difficulty and encounter balancing out of the hands of the level and enemy designers in case you do not have the time to have your team change up a boss or a level. Because the in-game difficulty is filtered through the resource management, the developer can get away with just tuning things around in there. So if a director has committed to a section which playtesters can't overcome, it's easy to fix because they can just add a lootable healing item into the run, an enemy who drops some, or an NPC who sells the stuff, and the director can rely on that to offset the accidental difficulty spike, rather than needing to revamp the level layout, which can take a lot more time given how tightly directed the minute-to-minute scenarios in Demon's Souls are. Or, if a director wants to take a relatively easy level and make it the scariest thing in the game, they can do what From Software did in Latria and just starve the player out. Every world in the game has one prominent lootable to farm within it. For the Castle of Boletaria, it's grass. For Stonefang, it's upgrade ore. For Latria, it's mana spice. For the Shrine of Storms, it is souls. And for the Valley of Defilement, it's status ailment healing lotuses. These items can also be found in other levels, it's just that they are more prominent in the one location, which helps individualize them somewhat, and which helps nudge the player a bit in the adventure, because any roadblock they face can more or less be overcome by obtaining an abundance of one or more of those specific items. They are not by any measure equally valuable, but because the minute-to-minute player direction usually has the player working around a low-value variable, that is either the player's depleting health, their skill, their souls when they are low, the status ailment, depleting mana, their stats, etc., just having an abundance of one of these things can allow the player to lean on those supplies to overcome the lack of the rest. And because the 5 most vital resources are so specifically coded to be more abundant in the 5 different maps, like I said,
there's a gentle force nudging the player to engage with each one with a slightly altered mindset,
because the specific abundance they have going for themselves at any given moment can be different.
Like I said, these resources are not locked behind only the one map. They still appear in other places because we still need to do player direction, and what I said about the developers turning a relatively easy level in Latria into pure hell by starving the player out is one of my favorite examples of just how strong the game direction in Demon's Souls really is. See, the first part of Latria, the Prison of Hope, is the only first level in the entire game which does not have a single healing grass item natively located anywhere for the player to find. So, if you've ever wondered just how they made the despair come through in the gameplay, there you have it. You're going through the whole thing on ever-dwindling resources, and the longer you go in without recovering healing resources or getting a checkpoint, the more that feeling of anxiety and despair starts to build up. And that feeling is not something easily replicatable in subsequent games, because in their mad dash to overcome the grinding problem of Demon's Souls, they undermined its greatest strength, which is that players can screw themselves.
Which is really what separates Demon's Souls from its children.
Listen, nobody likes endlessly having to farm. Having that penalty attached to suboptimal play undoubtedly bleeds some of the player base, who just don't bother to pick the game up again, but it makes the resources players have feel that much more important. Demon's Souls has the absolute least regard for player convenience out of any Miyazaki or a From game. Forget survival horror resource management, none of the other games attempted something as elaborate and punishing as world tendency. Nor did they try to recapture the magic of that system. That being that, if you play poorly, the game gets harder. Even Sekiro didn't fly this close to the sun. They actually dumbed that game's dragon rot mechanic down from what it was originally. And it's not like the world tendency or depletable healing items are necessary for delivering on this mood or on this cruelty and the despair it can elicit, but having those tools certainly helps. If you screw up a run to the boss in Demon's Souls, not only do you have to make your way back to your souls, you have to do it with fewer resources than in your last run, because you do not recover the healing items you invested into the run that failed. And if you don't manage to get your lost souls, not only do you lose the souls permanently, but recovering from the loss sets you at 0 because you also don't have the souls to buy new healing resources. And when the player is deep into a level on their last batch of healing items, the anxiety is going to hit so much harder in Demon's Souls than in subsequent games because the penalty looming over them is so much crueler. Now, there's plenty of arguments against grass healing, and the ideal way of playing through Demon's Souls, which I've laid out here, can be skirted around with some abusable tactics. On that front, Dark Souls' Estes system was a big step in the right direction. Estes healing takes the basic parameters established by the grass system and tries to fix both healing limit caps to smooth out the roughness and abuse potential from Demon's Souls. Grass did have a top cap, but the top cap was determined by item burden, so the amount of healing a player could have on their person was quite generous, to say the least. And the bottom cap of 0 meant that the penalty attached to death was much steeper than many players were willing to accept. So in Dark Souls, every time the player rests at a bonfire, they get 5 flasks for free, and if they want to increase this cap to the maximum 20, they need to offer humanity, which replaces grass as the lootable healing item, and they need the Rite of Kindling, which they need to find in the world. This change streamlines the adventure, since players never need to take specific time out to grind so they can heal, which also lets the ambience of the levels sink in a bit deeper, since the player can retry the same area more often in an unbroken streak. The change also removes the abuse potential of grass by actually having a clear numeric top cap to how much healing the player can do without stopping at a bonfire. That's more or less the gist of the Estes is absolutely better argument, but this is actually underplaying Estes' hand because there's deeper ramifications still on the wider experience which cascade from the implementation of Estes, which Dark Souls fans can boast about, like standardization. Randomness, or chaos, are both very difficult to design with, because The more choices the player has at their disposal at a given time, the more testing you need to do to ensure that the game never breaks, and utilizing systems to direct the experience rather than handcrafting the stuff always removes the tightness of encounters and creates inconsistent dips and peaks in difficulty based on nothing else than where the player allocated a given stat, what aspect of the game they have a particularly difficult time wrapping their heads around, if any, or just because the parameters of the systems need to juggle being open enough for the player to actually work with it. So grass needs to be discoverable for Demon Souls to work, while also directing the player's experience to congeal with the intended mood. Maybe even more so than the generous top cap on grass, Demon Souls' leveling system is kind of that game's Achilles heel, because physical defense is attached to every stat, so no matter how the player allocates their levels, they always get better at tanking damage. That is actually a pretty decent workaround to the potential problem of broken builds, since this means that every level up does improve the player in at least this very fundamental way. The problem here was that armor defenses in that game were static, and if the player decided to farm for souls, the late game can have the player's own innate defenses be enough to tank through most of the damage thrown their way. And at that point, the weight classes of the armors, which govern the player's movement and rolling speeds, become very expensive liabilities for relatively little reward. So, especially for the multiplayer, the nudist epidemic began. Dark Souls overhauled armors to be upgradable so that players wouldn't just bare-ass their way through the game at a certain threshold, and for as much as Dark Souls did to try and fix this, it wasn't enough, so Bloodborne had to decouple armors from weight classes altogether, removing the penalty for armors to ensure that they never became a burden. I think this armor anecdote is more or less a perfect summary of the difference between Dark Souls and Demon Souls, where every perceived problem in Demon Souls is still very much present in Dark Souls, but the edges have been somewhat sanded off and the cracks have had some duct tape applied over them to make the experience more player-friendly. The experience overall loses some of its directorial tightness and expressive range, but in exchange the package is a lot better compartmentalizable, and each area becomes a lot more intuitive to navigate because the governing directorial systems are the same all throughout the game. That's standardization. Since there's a hard minimum number of Estus flasks, which players always recover when they die, there's a knock-on effect in the level design, which is that difficulty balancing is hypothetically just a question of how far we can reasonably stretch 5 Estus flasks. Dark Souls has much fewer insane difficulty spikes, in the early game at least, than Demon Souls, and Estus healing might have contributed a lot to that. While testing an area in Demon Souls, the developers don't have a guaranteed number of grass items on hand to dial things around, so they need to either test with an arbitrary number, which is not optimal, or they need to test it around 0 moon grass items, which has its own issues, since either that requires a level of skill from the players which is not reasonable to expect from newcomers, or it scales the difficulty of that game down too drastically. Dark Souls does not have this issue. There's not a single level which ever needs to be designed around the player not having any healing items, or any way of acquiring more healing items, because the 5 Estus flasks are free. Hypothetically, to balance the difficulty of every run from every bonfire in the game to the next bonfire, the devs just needed to know the general level boundary they were working with and needed to see if they could make the gap in 5 or less Estus flasks. Much is made about this point, and while it is undoubtedly true, on paper, there's something crucial missing from this observation, which I'll circle back around to in a bit. A knock-on effect to the knock-on effect Estus had on the level design is seen in the world design. Since the player does not need to teleport back to a central hub, since they get their healing items for free when they touch a bonfire, the game can offer up substantially more free time for the player to just get lost in the world. Bafflingly, this is the best change, moving from Demon Souls to Dark Souls, and no other Dark Souls game thought to expand on this. But I digress. There's more uninterrupted playtime in Dark Souls than in Demon Souls, and because of this, the world design can really shine. The mid-game has the player unlock a warp feature, basically a necessity at that point because the world had become so vast, interwoven yet compact, that it might have collapsed in on itself if the early game map had to accommodate the same level of verticality and integration for the post-mid-game maps as it does for the early game ones. This takes a bit of the shine off of Dark Souls, but this actually allows us to compare it to Demon Souls very directly, because Seath's levels, Ulasil and Isolith, all function much closer to how Demon Souls' levels did than they do the early game Dark Souls levels, where they are more of a straight shot through a gauntlet. More on this later though, because the best practices the healing systems impose on level design is quite interesting and worth digging into. Demon Souls can build up moments of dread in Latria by refusing the player healing items, but Dark Souls can take you from Firelink Shrine, through Undead Burg, all the way to the depths, then to Blighttown, the Great Hollow, and Ash Lake, and I'm pretty sure you'd only need to watch one cutscene, which is the one that introduces the Gaping Dragon boss. That degree of unbroken experience is something which really can't be done well in a game which uses a system like grass healing, unless every bonfire also has vendors for the stuff. Another knock-on effect from the Estes system, this time a knock-on effect to the world design itself, is just how independent the player is from any one bonfire, and because of this, so are all of the other NPCs. Dark Souls' NPCs have long been lauded for how they don't always show up in locations just for the convenience of the player. They act as very free agents in the world, which makes it feel much more special when you encounter them organically. Demon Souls most certainly did also have NPCs who dipped in and out of the Nexus, but that every NPC had predetermined locations robbed the magic of this decision more in that game because the characters were always locked to a single path, whereas in Dark Souls, while they were also locked to mostly single paths, because the paths weren't as obviously chunked off from the rest of the game, since the player can almost walk from one end of the map to every other, the predetermined nature of the NPC storylines feels a bit more organic. And because so much of the Dark Souls charm is in being an independent and free agent in the world, when you see that approach replicated in the NPCs, it comes through a lot clearer. Dark Souls' devotion to player independence, which includes replacing grass healing with Estus, facilitates this, and it's a testament to good game design that this isn't a disaster. Obviously, if the NPCs really mattered, not only could they not have gotten away with this, but the game would be a nightmare to get through. So thankfully, the NPCs are superfluous, meaningful, impactful, but not necessities. The player is not dependent on a single vendor outside of some builds, and even then. So the level designers don't need to have a rule which places a health item vendor near every bonfire to let the players heal. Nor do they need to make enemies which drop healing items in every area. Because of this, there's much fewer moments where the player can notice just how much the world is set up for their convenience than there is in many other games. If you appreciate this getting lost in the world motif of Dark Souls 1, you really can't appreciate the Estus system enough. If you try to make this work with grass healing, there's so many nails you need to hammer down to make it workable and so much jank to design around. How do you trap the player in Blighttown? How would the prison sequence in the Duke's Archives work? You could not make Dark Souls work with Demon Souls' healing system because the cumulative design decisions which are made with the healing mechanics grandfathered so deep into the experience become obnoxious and meat-grindery very quickly. I'm sure everyone knows exactly what I'm about to say next, but this line of thinking leads us to conclude that Demon Souls would also suffer if it had to be played with Estus healing. Think about what we talked about earlier and how Demon Souls having healing incorporated into looting can be used to gin up moments of hope and despair, and how Latria's first level has no healing for the player to find and instead is just a prolonged season of dread because the resources invested into a given run are not recoverable. Mixing and matching mechanics like this without paying careful attention to the ramifications on the larger experience is obviously a recipe for disaster, so if you're going to take the world design of Dark Souls, but the healing from Demon Souls, clearly you'd need to do something more to accommodate the new best practices this hybrid system would elicit. I think it's fair to directly compare Demon Souls and Dark Souls in this video, because while they are utilizing different systems for healing, the rest of the gameplay is so similar that their individual differences are almost certainly traceable back to the healing mechanics. If you remade Demon Souls from page 1 and the only core change you applied was making healing free, I think that after playtesting to find the best practices and design principles, you would just end up making something akin to Dark Souls 1, and vice versa. This is obviously an oversimplification, but you can see how the same core experience would fork when you fiddle around with one central mechanic like this. In a head-to-head, comparing the healing from Demon Souls to Dark Souls makes a lot of sense. For Bloodborne, however, we need to add some caveats to ensure that we aren't being unfair. Bloodborne's blood vials are depletable like grass, but hard top-capped like Estes. They are lootable in the world, so the level designers can use them to direct the player's experience, like how grass did, but they are also locked onto a singular upgrade path rather than differently valued based on which variant of the healing resource it is. So Demon Souls had a lot of different grass types, but Dark Souls just has the one Estus flask for the players to upgrade. And Bloodborne just has the one blood vial type, which levels up dynamically with the player. On paper, because the blood vials are such a hybrid of the two previous healing systems, they should be able to satisfy the best practices of both previous games, but in practice, that's not necessarily the case. As we've gone over, if you want the interconnected world of Dark Souls, it's not so good that the bottom cap to the vials is 0. As for Demon Souls, while blood vials do satisfy the function of being lootable in levels and thus are able to lure the player like how lootable grass was, because Demon Souls had more healing unit variety and because it had item burden, it was able to create an in-between levels game with the player where they got to spend a bit of time in the headspace of a prepared adventurer. Because that game's mechanics made for moments where the player needed to plan things out. For the optimal Demon Souls experience, you don't rush recklessly into danger. Bloodborne's vial system has its own quirks, and the best utilities of that system are found when you playtest with that system rather than it being gluing an old design tree on top of this. Not to mention, of course, that Bloodborne's real healing system is the rallying mechanic. Just like how Sekiro's Deathblow mechanic seems like a natural evolution of Bloodborne's stun parry mechanic, the rallying mechanic in Bloodborne seems like a natural evolution of Dark Souls' Evil Eye Ring. That thing gave the player health when they killed enemies, which I love, because it's actually healing which isn't free, looking at you, Demon Souls' Adjudicator Shield. And the rallying mechanic allows players to regain lost health if they're able to quickly do damage after being hit. This means that Bloodborne is the first of these games where taking a hit is not inherently a sign of bad play. The player can actually eat some blows in exchange for good placement and just recover the lost health right away, which makes a lot of sense because, according to Miyazaki, the function of the rallying healing mechanic was to have the players fight for their lives. That's the intended experience for Bloodborne, and just like how Grass and Estes both forked every other design decision because they are both so core to the experiences of their respective games, you see the ramifications of the rallying mechanic everywhere in Bloodborne when you think to look for it. For example, outside of the Chalice dungeons and the Hunter's Nightmare, the hazards in levels in Bloodborne are almost exclusively from enemies, because traps like spikes and bolts and such cannot be rallied against. This system nudges the player into duking it out for longer and to get in the enemy's face, and once the players become acclimated to it, it will have extracted a very different playstyle out of the player compared to Demon Souls or Dark Souls. So much of the mood of Bloodborne comes from this rallying mechanic being in the game, and while it's very, very good for the kind of game which Bloodborne is, it's not really something you'd want in Demon Souls or Dark Souls, because those games are a lot more about situational awareness and slow, methodical moving through levels. Imagine trying to pull off something with the sensibilities of Latria with the rallying healing system of Bloodborne. How bad would the Latrium would suffer with a healing system which directed the player into duking it out all the time, instead of being hyper-cautious. The strength of Demon Souls' healing system is putting the player in the mind of a methodical and prepared adventurer and its ability to create dread. For Dark Souls, it's probably getting the player lost in the world. For Bloodborne, it's this whole getting players fighting for their lives thing. I'm sorry if I'm making this sound like it's some deep new insight, when really, what we're talking about here is just quality game direction. I talked earlier about how Dark Souls' level balancing could simply be a question of whether a run is acceptable with 5 Estus flasks, and I said that I would touch on that again. While theoretically applicable, the reality of game development almost certainly had them throw this philosophy out of the window every now and then, if this was indeed a pillar of their design philosophy. For one, when tweaking the difficulty around the player's expected level range, it's always going to be easier to just scale certain enemies down than it is to shorten or lengthen the levels, to let the Estus flasks be the main guidepost for what is and is not acceptable. And if they did tweak everything around the 5 Estus flask minimum instead of the enemy damage, they'd need to contend with poor level balancing going into 2 directions. Either a given level is too short, in which case this mantra would require them to pad the level on the back end, or it's too long, which means breaking the level up even more, so that every segment is reasonable, with 5 Estus flasks. And the likelihood when segmenting the levels like this that you end on an even 5 is very low, so maybe the segments all have 3 or 4 flasks be the standard instead. That's not to say that Dark Souls 1's bonfire placements are bad, but the best levels in Dark Souls, think the Painted World of Ariamis, or Darkroot Garden, or New Londo, these places don't actually function well with a 5 Estus minimum. Instead, a single unbroken run without resting for a newcomer would have 10 Estus be the bare minimum. But those levels aren't actually designed around a single run anyways, because the best practice for level design, as it turns out, was not to map them out to 5 Estus flasks, it was to have the levels continue to loop back around to the starting bonfire. I didn't really ever think about this before making the video, but the best Dark Souls levels always just have the one bonfire at the start, which has 1 or more shortcuts going back to it, while the level which spawns out from that bonfire is ultimately much longer than 5 Estus flasks. Because the player can build up progress over time, a single bonfire is enough. I'm certain that at a given level threshold of every build, 5 Estus flasks are the perfect sweet spot for opening up shortcuts like this, but the balancing there isn't in the Estus flasks. Instead, because of the open progression nature of the game, it's in the player's relative level range. All of this is not to say that Estus doesn't help with game balancing, but that the theory underpinning Estus balancing needs more variables to consider before it becomes suitable for the actual task of difficulty balancing each area. Estus flasks definitely play a part, governing the parameters of difficulty balancing, but much like how it is in Demon Souls and Bloodborne, the real difficulty balancing is done within the levels themselves. The enemy damage, for example. In Demon Souls and Bloodborne, if the developers ever found a path to be too difficult for the expected level range of the player, they could just plop some healing items down for the player to find, or make an enemy drop something for them. Bloodborne also has the added trick of every enemy being free health if the player is good enough at the game. In Dark Souls, the Estus system does help balance the levels, but the other titles have mechanics which can do this trick as well, and they aren't exactly struggling to get the job done without Estus standardization. Also, after Anor Londo, levels don't offer nearly as many looping paths to shortcuts back to the starting bonfire. Instead, like I said earlier, they become much more linear, become much more like how levels are in Demon Souls and Bloodborne. It's a shame that the late game of Dark Souls is so rushed, because if it was up to the standards established by the early game, we'd be able to see just how much of the dip in quality came about from the rushed production and how much can be traced back to the healing system being made to guardrail an experience which is just a bit outside of the range of its best practices. This is why, in spite of liking a lot about them, I'm not so hot on Dark Souls 2 and 3. Their healing systems have their own unique quirks like life gems, gradual hollowing, and ashen Estus, so it's not quite fair of me to slot them into this discussion like this without contextualizing them within their own frame first, but I think regardless of how warranted their changes may or may not have been, and how much they do or do not contribute to the game direction in those games, with a few exceptions, I don't think the scenario direction of those games ever lived up to the standards of Demon Souls, early game Dark Souls 1, or Bloodborne. And I think a lot of that can be traced back to how Estus isn't being used at its best in those games. Compare its utilization there, and in the late game of Dark Souls 1, to how Estus propped up the early game of Dark Souls 1.
Estes is really good when you're getting lost in the world, or when you make incremental progress from a bonfire by opening up more and more shortcuts that all loop back to it, but when you're dealing with a more conventional straight shot through a level, I'd argue that however flawed the implementation of grass might have been in Demon's Souls, if the aim was to drench a given area in a desolate mood, like it almost always is in these games, depletable healing resources are still a better pick, because resource management allows for game direction like starving the player out of scarce resources, making them quite anxious about when they're going to loot more healing items, and because the cost on any given run is much steeper when you don't get the basic healing items for free every time you respawn, retreating back to safety is much more expensive than it is when you use Estes, because the progress you lose actually has a cost assigned to it other than time. In the case of both Estes and Grass, player familiarity with the levels does increase even when they retreat, but because it does not auto-regenerate, in practice, only the scarce resource system imposes a liability for exploration. It's not excessive or anything, but it is there. Your mileage may of course vary, but I think there's a reason Estes does not show up again in Bloodborne. The only cost to rallying here is to take the hit in the first place. Using blood vials is a cost for bad play. But if the blood vials were free, the whole directing the player to fight for their lives sensibility of Bloodborne's combat, it just wouldn't come through as cleanly, because the alternative to rally healing would be free Estes healing. As it is, players learn to appreciate rallying, partly because the alternative is kind of expensive. And that risk versus reward of getting greedy and duking it out to conserve resources does so much for the minute-to-minute mood of Bloodborne's combat. If you had Estes, rallying would only be a better healing option when you're very low on those and are fighting slower enemies. It's because the blood vials are depletable and cost money that players are pushed this hard into embracing the rally mechanic, and because of that, the sense of the game's combat, which Miyazaki talked about, is able to come through right away. Before moving on to talk about Sekiro, I want to stress that for the kind of games the 3 games I've talked about are, I think the healing systems they have are all great. I think every one of them has some issues in implementation, every one of them could have been better, like, I don't know, I haven't spent years obsessing about these games or anything, and haven't thought of what I'd do if for some reason they ever bring me in to do a recut of Demon's Souls, but don't you think that game would be a lot more based if the top limit to grass was 20? And I don't mean the top limit on how much the player can carry, I mean top limit present in the world at any time, so that across the overworld, the player's war chest, inventory, and vendors, there are never more than 20 grass items in existence. Not that I've been thinking about this for a long time or anything. I cannot condone armchair game direction, after all. Yeah, right. Anyways, the healing mechanics which Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne have, and the way the rest of the games are built on top of the best practices of those systems, I think is great. They all make a lot of sense for their specific titles. Sekiro is when I think this is no longer the case. And it's because I don't think the ethos of the game is seen so much in the healing until pretty late in. According to Miyazaki, for Sekiro, they really wanted to make a combat system where the life or death clashes of katanas came through, and they wanted the player to really get into the headspace of a sneaky ninja who's able to use everything at their disposal as a weapon. In the combat department, this is accomplished largely with the death blows. If you sneak up on an enemy, you get those for free, so the magic of optimization softly funnels players into using the limited stealth options at their disposal to their maximum capacity. As for the clashing katanas, if the player's timing is exceptional and their blocks are perfect, they can destroy an enemy's posture bar much quicker than the player can the enemy's health, so if the player allows the rhythm of the combat to gently guide them, they quickly come to adapt to the dance-like nature of Sekiro's combat. One kind of healing in Sekiro is of course the trademarked resurrection mechanic, die and then come back to life. And this is where Sekiro is very different from the previous games. See, you'd think that the resurrection mechanic is so core to the game's identity that
Surely it was there from day one, and the rest of the game was built with it in mind, but no, playtesters were dying too fast, so the development team decided to add it to extend the duration of play sessions. Of Sekiro's two main healing systems, I think the resurrection mechanic is superior. There's actually some tactical use to get out of this thing, like when you have two resurrections available and are fighting a boss. You can let the boss kill you once before dealing a death blow to them in order to maximize the healing you get from the resurrection. The second resurrection is always locked until you get a death blow, so if you time it right, you can die, revive for the extra health, then quickly death blow the boss and unlock a second resurrection. The other main healing system, the one I don't like quite as much as the resurrection mechanic, is the other variation on Estus healing. It reapplies the change introduced in Dark Souls 2, which was that the maximum flasks start out at 1, an excellent change in my opinion, but just like Dark Souls 2 and 3, warping is there from the get-go, and the world design is not directed for the players getting lost in the world, which is the best thing the Estus system accomplished, in my opinion. Please just make a game that focuses on that again. No, but instead, it's taken for granted that players will warp around the world, and so the best utility of the Estus system is not there. They also decided to kick Sekiro in the shin by adding some extra healing items like pellets and rice and such, which the player can use. Those are all capped in the inventory, and the pellets, the most common extra health item, heals gradually, so the different healing options are better at different times. These are all justified in the game's story, and in practice, they, and the gourd healing system, Ninja Estus, do the job of letting the player recover from damage, and they do so without really breaking the core ninja experience. The player darts in and out of encounters as they believe their options are good and bad, and being able to heal up in this traditional way while breaking from the fighting lets the player cool down some and prepare to get back into the thick of things. Outside of the specific context of this video, I don't really have any major issues with the healing in Sekiro, but because we're discussing the healing systems in these games, it kinda helps to look at Sekiro and how removed the healing is from directing the experience compared to the previous 3 games we've talked about. Obviously, that's not really a serious issue since there are other mechanics in this game which pick up the slack of player direction. In the abstract, this healing system is perfectly fine. But again, in the context of this specific video, it's a bit of a letdown considering what came before. Until after Mibu Village, when the player gets the Breath of Life skill. That thing lets the player recover health after dealing a death blow to an opponent, and it's one of the best mechanics in the game, right after that awesome anime move where Wolf can redirect lightning attacks. The ramifications of attaching healing to death blows is obviously that players capitalize more on those and are pushed a bit deeper into embracing the stealthy ninja lifestyle. This also has some relevance in boss fights since those have more than one death blow, and being able to strategically time a death blow for max healing potential is quite useful. But this mid-ish game shakeup to the healing actually goes much deeper because Sekiro's story is all about healing. The story's dragon rot disease is actually caused by the resurrections of those who have received the dragon's blood. They cannot truly die and keep resurrecting, but they do so by parasitically leeching off of the life force around them. This is all understood by the characters in the game as being a disease, but it's actually us. And the idea here, the idea with immortality in Sekiro, is that it is fundamentally parasitic. You can see it in the Dragon Nobles and Fountainhead Palace, who are the game's repackaging of the Mind Flayer enemy, who enfeeble the player and eat our vitality, and the vitality of others to keep themselves alive. We can also see this in the Pot Noble, who wishes to become immortal by becoming a carp, and asks the player to feed him the scales of other carps in order to help make this happen. We have the monks of Senpu and the Guardian Ape, who have all ingested or manifested within themselves centipedes who can pilot their bodies even after death. There's the Rejuvenating Sediment, which is a stagnant variant of the healing waters which Ashina gets from the Sakura Dragon. And there's of course the Black Mortal Blade, which Genichiro uses to kill himself to revive Ishin in the end. And yes, that version of Ishin is immortal, as is confirmed by the text we get when we kill him. Sekiro is a game about a land which has taken the immortality of the Sakura Dragon, but the idea of the Sakura, the cherry blossom, is actually that it is impermanent. It's beautiful specifically because it doesn't last for long. And when the actors in the world try to pervert this, the land itself begins to rot. This is why the field of Silvergrass bookends the game. I talked about this extensively in my commentary on this game, so returning viewers will forgive me for repeating myself, but in Japan, the color white symbolizes death. And when we got to this place in the beginning of the game, that was an ominous omen. But in the end, after we've gone through Ashina and seen all these different variations of stagnant immortality, we come to see that death is actually what the land needs. And it becomes kind of a beautiful thing. And while the Dragon Rod mechanic and the Breath of Life skills try, this idea of immortality being parasitic never really comes through in the mechanics, I feel. Firstly, the Dragon Rod only spreads when you truly die, but in lore, that's not necessarily the correct death to apply this to. Not every death is equally canon. Some bosses change their behaviors based on whether or not we've died to them once already, but I guess this is something the game can get away with asking the player to handwave away. But for the parasitic immortality idea, the Breath of Lives are precisely what is missing from the get-go. That, to heal, the player needs to actively feed off of the world around them. There's potentially some harmful ramifications for the following mechanic, but humor me for a moment as I actually about how healing could have worked. Imagine if instead of Estes, or healing gourds, we could prompt for Wolf to pray to fill his health bar by having every enemy in the vicinity lose a certain percentage of their health. This kind of healing would tie into the parasitic immortality theme. It would be very unique, and it would even make healing have some tactical offensive utility, which is very on brand for Sekiro, a game about using everything, even death, as a weapon. For boss fights, this would obviously damage them less than it does regular enemies. We can't let the player just insta-kill bosses by healing, and if we want to have the player be able to upgrade this, like they do the healing gourd, maybe they can find something in the world which increases the amount of praying they can do in a single life by 1 each. If prayer beats weren't already attached to upgrading the player's max health and posture, I'd have recommended them as a way to upgrade the prayer healing, but apparently they preempted this pitch of mine. The changes needed to implement this mechanic would be to increase every enemy's health by maybe 1 to 4% in order to rebalance the amount of free damage the player could deal, and in exchange we tie the parasitic immortality into the gameplay much more directly. That would tie over any gameplay implementation concerns I can think of, since I don't really see how this would really alter the level design or anything, but there is something to be said about characterization here. If we are in a world where immortality is parasitic, it might give the wrong impression of Wolf to let the player casually leech off of the life force of others like this. That's already happening with death, but characterization-wise, it's much easier to rationalize Wolf resurrecting to continue with his mission than him straight up just hiding in a bush and praying his enemies to death. As it stands, the Breath of Life mechanic and the Dragon Rod do the heavy lifting of gamifying parasitic immortality. Let me reiterate though that these are not bad healing systems. I'm not down on Sekiro because it doesn't get the job done of player direction. I'm not even down on it in general. It's just that in the context of analyzing the ramifications of the healing mechanics in these games that Sekiro looks like a bit of a letdown. Of course, things could always get a little bit worse. If you thought I was going to include an elaborate talk on Elden Ring's healing, I'm sadly going to leave you somewhat disappointed. I don't think there's really anything remarkable about how that game handles things on this front, and for the kind of game Elden Ring is, I don't know how healing could have really been at the center of things. The story is about stagnation and the horrors unleashed when the natural order of the world was perverted, like all of these games are, but there's just so much going on and so little management of the player's minute-to-minute experience that any page 1 overhaul of healing for that game would almost certainly have needed to be done at the beginning of development in order to ensure the experience leaned into the best which the gameplay had to offer. If Elden Ring used a new kind of resource management healing system where crafting was also a big deal, that might get the players looking around for materials more and get them invested in that aspect of the game, but the core mechanics of Elden Ring are basically the same as they were in Demon's Souls, and third-person dungeon crawling gameplay might not be at its best when it's asked to deeply immerse the player in a vast open world.
especially not one with as much acid reuse as Elden Ring has, which would probably really hurt this experience if it was more focused on getting the player to engage with the world like this, picking berries and the like. Out of the systems we've discussed so far, the Estus healing was almost certainly the best option to take, but I feel that without the outlandish world geometry of Dark Souls 1, or its crampedness for that matter, we don't so much get lost in the lands between as we just go from one end of the map to another. Plus, we have fast travel from the start, yet again, so we're not really committing to travels as much as we did in Dark Souls 1. There are some genuine "where have I found myself now" lost in the world moments, but the overworld itself might just be a bit too flat and uninteresting level design-wise to have warp-free Estus healing Dark Souls 1 early game style have been a reasonable request, because getting from A to B takes so much more time in Elden Ring. Interaction-based healing like Bloodborne's Rallying or Sekiro's Breath of Life might also have been bad ideas here, since the overworld design lets us run past everything, and the level design in the gauntlets is so much weaker than in both of those games that enemy encounters are not only easy to avoid, but are sometimes best to avoid considering how many enemies are placed very uninspiredly in the maps. The open nature of Elden Ring undermines a lot of the quality player direction we've seen from Software before, and it's hard to try to implement something without fundamentally changing every other component of the game. For example, if the game had been coded such that line of sight to the Erd tree had passively healed the player, and that had been the main healing mechanic, then the gauntlets would suffer since the player could always retreat back to a previous location where they'd already killed all of the enemies to get the healing. To fix that, the enemies maybe could always just respawn after a given amount of time, but a lot of the gameplay is being smart with your resources and runes, so being able to retreat is actually something you wouldn't want to rob the player of like that. There's also to consider the ramifications this has on the larger interiors, like the caves or the eternal cities, the post-burning, the Erdtree game, and what if any effects the weather would have, since rolling fogs could block the line of sight. Hammering down how to fix each of those issues might sound fun, and the added challenges imposed on the player might be conceptually interesting, but in practice, something like this would almost certainly be a nightmare unless the rest of the game was completely reconfigured for this kind of healing. The system the game does have does heal, but even more so than in Sekiro, the healing feels almost like an afterthought, whereas it was always such a big part of the player direction before. It's there. It lets you heal if you want to heal, but it's very unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. At least compared to the games we've discussed so far. And on the topic of those games we've discussed so far, this video was originally just going to be a head-to-head of Grass versus Estus, but since every paragraph I wrote ended with, "and that's why this system makes sense for the kind of game this is," I decided to rework it instead to talk about the butterfly effect of game design. Core mechanics have cascading effects on multiple subsequent mechanics because other mechanics become tuned around those core mechanics functioning in a very specific way, and to squeeze the best experience out of the mechanics you have, you begin to exclude options from your game so you can instead hone in on what your game does best. If you have depletable healing, you'll start directing levels to take advantage of that. If you have free healing, you'll decide on a world design which takes advantage of that. If you have interaction-based healing, you'll design enemy AI which takes advantage of that, etc. And the more you build on top of those grandfathered in design decisions, the harder it is to reverse them. Demon Souls' healing does have issues. Grass is very abusable, being able to keep 99 of each type on hand at every moment is very generous, but that does not mean that it should have had Estus, because every other design decision in Demon Souls, the level direction and such, relies on the player going through dwindling resources, and to say that Demon Souls would be better if it included Estus is to say that Demon Souls would be better if the player direction, which is in the game, was largely tuned around items which the player no longer has a reason to care about. And if you were to redesign Demon Souls from the ground up to use Estus, best case scenario is you've just made the early part of Dark Souls 1 again. And if you stray away from the interconnected world design of Dark Souls 1 and use Estus for a more linear package like in Demon Souls, well, that's the worst case scenario. Because you've just made Dark Souls 3 again. Ha 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 ha.
But different systems and different game directorial aims can hit differently for different people. You're not wrong for preferring one system over the others, but you are wrong if you think they are interchangeable without serious reworking of the game around them. I'm Grass Healing's strongest soldier, not because I'm blind to the advantages of the other alternatives, but because I think the minute-to-minute of game direction in Demon Souls is just better than in subsequent games, and I can't help but notice how much the healing system in that game is responsible for that. The top cap is abusable, and the bottom cap can impose grinding upon the player, but when the game can deliver on a level like the Shrine of Storms or Latria, and no subsequent game managed to reach that height for me again, the issues that I do have with the grass system become so small in comparison to what it adds to the experience. I know that a certain segment of the community will never see it that way, but that's just the way it is. If you like this video, consider checking out some of the other videos I've made on these games, like the Big Mondo commentaries for Bloodborne and Sekiro. There's links in the description which you can check out. While you're there, consider hitting all the little bips and bops and liking the video, subscribing, commenting some of your own thoughts about healing and what have you. Please be nice to me though. I really hope you consider subscribing because I know this take of mine is not popular and I might have just cratered my channel by putting it out there. Please give me a crumb of subscription. Help me reach 50Ks. Special thanks goes out to the patrons who help me make videos like this one possible. I love you all, patrons. You can join the channel Patreon yourself by going to patreon.com/medievalmegaman, linked below, where you'll get early access to more content like this. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.